Major breaking news and excellent news for our Second Amendment rights, and very, very bad news for deep state and in particular the ATF. I'm going to compliment the Trump transition team and the Trump administration for connecting the dots in a spectacular way. Oh, the anti-gunners are not going to like this. Let's talk about it when we get back. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the Four Box of Diner, proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney, member of the United States Supreme Court Bar, and I'm proud to say the winner of the top voice of the Second Amendment in America at the 2025 Gundies Awards. Great competition. It was always a great honor to receive any kind of accolade from the Gundies Awards, given the excellent, powerful Second Amendment advocates out there, and I'm proud to say we here at the Four Box of Diner were named the top voice of the Second Amendment. Okay, folks, so this is huge news. This may very well become the beginning of the end of the ATF. And I don't like to say things lightly. I'm not Mr. Hyperbole. I try to keep you grounded, right? I try to kind of, be a straight shooter. I'm not Mr. Rainbows and Unicorns and, put out a bunch of stuff like, the Supreme Court's decision today is going to wipe out all federal gun control law. I don't kind of do that stuff as a general matter, right? Okay, with that said, this is extremely good news for the Second Amendment, and it could very well be the beginning of the end of the ATF. What does that mean? So the news, it's this, you're probably familiar with this, but Dan Bongino, the former NRA spokesperson for NRA-TV, right? He was a commentator. He was one of the anchors, very powerful advocate for the right to keep and bear arms on NRA-TV, back when it was there with Dana Loesch and others, of course. Dan Bongino has gone on and done a lot of great things since the NRA, of course, but he was a powerful advocate for our right to keep and bear arms. Dan Bongino has been named the Deputy Director of the FBI. Now, I want you to listen carefully to this. I'm going to be a little geeky here, but you're going to really, really like the outcome of what I'm about to say. Dan Bongino has been named the Deputy Director of the FBI. Now, here's the interesting thing. If you look at the Plum Book, which we've talked about before, those are the 7,000 jobs that are available for presidential appointments. If you look at the Plum Book, there are several jobs that are restricted within the ATF to career civil servants. But if you then look at the Plum Book for the purposes of the FBI, there is only one position that is listed in the Plum Book that has some sort of restriction about who can serve in that role. That is the Director of the FBI. But the Director of the FBI is Kash Patel, who was nominated by the President and confirmed by the U.S. Senate. He is now the Director of the FBI. As part of his job at the FBI, Kash Patel, as the Director, gets to go out and hire people that he likes, that he thinks are appropriate, often in consultation with the President of the United States. I'm sure that FBI Director Kash Patel coordinated this with President Donald Trump and Attorney General Pam Bondi, because Pam Bondi is the Attorney General of the United States, oversees the FBI and the ATF. And they have picked Dan Bongino to be the Deputy Director of the FBI. So now, we have Kash Patel is the Director of the FBI, Senate confirmed, very powerful position in the hierarchy of federal employment law and under the Plum Book. And remember, the Plum Book tells you who the President can hire and what their credentials and background have to be and what has to be done for them to take over that role. Kash Patel is now the Director of the FBI, but remember what I said the other day. Kash Patel has been named, or is in the process of being named, as the acting director of the ATF. So let's think about what we have here, folks, and then we're going to break it down in even more detail. Where we are right now is we have the President of the United States, Donald Trump, that is great on the Second Amendment. I've told you before, he's the best Second Amendment president we've ever had. Period, full stop. I still believe that. Okay? And I think it's going to get even better moving forward. He issued an executive order that says he wants all of the government to look to see what parts of the federal government, including the Department of Justice and Joe Biden, violated the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms, and make sure that doesn't happen anymore. He also picked Attorney General Pam Bondi, who is now confirmed as the Attorney General of the United States. And I know there's some criticisms of things that occurred in 2018 and 2019 involving Pam Bondi was the Attorney General of Florida. I don't think any of that's going to repeat itself. We don't need to get into that right now. But right now, Pam Bondi has been an excellent Attorney General. In addition to making sure that executive order to support the Second Amendment is being carried out effectively, that was the executive order by President Trump. Attorney General Pam Bondi fired the chief counsel of the ATF. Now, this is very important. I know this is a little geeky here, but if you think about what I just said, Pam Bondi fired the chief counsel of the ATF. The only person realistically that could push back against an acting director of the ATF in any respect would be the general counsel, the chief counsel, because the attorney, there's a lot of games they can play, but the acting, or I should say the chief counsel of the ATF, who was a career civil servant, a classic deep stater as best I can tell. That seems to be the case based on the record. Also, apparently based on the reports I've seen. I haven't confirmed this, but the reports I've seen that the chief counsel of the ATF was a Democratic donor. I wouldn't be surprised at all if that were the case. So the bottom line is Pam Bondi has fired the chief counsel of the ATF, and then, of course, is working with Kash Patel as the director of the FBI and has named, with President Trump, Kash Patel to be the acting director of the ATF. And as I've talked about in my prior video, being an acting director has potential issues because they can argue you lack certain legal authority because you haven't been confirmed by the U.S. Senate and appointed by the President of the United States. But in this case, Kash Patel has been nominated by the President and confirmed by the U.S. Senate for the purpose of director of FBI. So those criticisms that you might see against, like, say, Jack Smith, the special counsel, who was a guy just picked off the street, never nominated by the President for anything, never confirmed by the U.S. Senate for anything. You don't have those Jack Smith problems with Kash Patel because he's been confirmed by the U.S. Senate now. So where we hear is you have President Trump, very good on the Second Amendment with that executive order. You have Pam Bondi, who just fired the chief counsel. She just went on national TV and said she fired the chief counsel of the ATF because she was going after gun owners. She was targeting gun owners. You have her as the Attorney General. Now you have Kash Patel as the head of the FBI, who's gun on guns, and then you have Kash Patel as the acting director of the ATF. Now you've just brought in Dan Bongino, who used to be one of the people on NRA-TV, very powerful political commentator. Communication is very important for all these jobs. Dan Bongino has just been picked to be the deputy director of the FBI. But here's the thing. If you look at the Plum Book, the deputy director of the FBI anyone could be it. There's no Senate confirmation. There's no limitation for civil servants or anything like that. So Dan Bongino can do this job right here, right now, without any concerns about restrictions we find in the Plum Book, which we've talked about before. So this is very good news because keep in mind that since Kash Patel is going to be overseeing the FBI and the ATF, nothing will prevent him from having conversations with his deputy director, Dan Bongino, about FBI business and ATF business because they're going to overlap. So now that's the groundwork, that's the framework. Now let's talk about the nitty-gritty of what this really means for the ATF and its future, which I actually think is going to be not a very bright, long future for what I'm about to say. Now that you have the parts in place, because remember, policy is personnel. If you get the right people in the right positions, the policy will follow. Now, with that said, let's think about the ATF, right? We're going to break down the ATF into its constituent parts, and then we're going to ask ourselves, what's left? What is still going to be on the bones once we've picked it apart in the following way? So let's just talk about what does the BATF stand for? It's actually the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. There's 4 components. Let's start with alcohol and tobacco. We're going to do this because you're going to see why the ATF is going to disappear in time, okay? Alcohol and tobacco, when it comes to the ATF, you're really just looking at, this is taxation issues. These are people that are trying to play games with federal taxes on alcohol or tobacco. Sometimes you have some issues with Native Americans. I mean, at least this is what I've been told. You have sort of like Indian tribes that play games with maybe alcohol, tobacco, how they distribute it or how they sell it or whether they pay taxes. Again, I don't know the details and I don't want to learn the details, but this is my general understanding that you will sometimes have illegal trafficking and games played over taxes dealing with alcohol and tobacco. So at the end of the day, alcohol and tobacco, the components of alcohol and tobacco, the part of the ATF dealing with alcohol and tobacco can easily be moved into, let's say, the IRS or to the Department of Commerce or some other part of the federal government. You don't need to have a standalone agency. And everyone, when they think of ATF, they don't think about alcohol and tobacco because those are not really big parts of what ATF does. So you can move those constituent parts anywhere and no one's going to care. You can even move it to the FBI and no one's going to care. So that leaves the 2 other constituent parts right of the ATF. That's firearms and explosives. So let's just look at explosives. The explosive part of the ATF, if you think about it, is really nothing more than a handful of training buildings, some facilities where they can learn about and teach people about bombs, how to disassemble bombs, how to identify arson. If there's a building is burned down, is it because of a bomb? Is it because of arson? Is it fire? How did it start? This kind of stuff. There's an investigatory component part. Bomb threats they sometimes get involved with. I think the ATF-E has been involved on the explosive side of things when they go out to California to deal with some of those forest fires, I believe, but I think they've touched fingers with some of these fire issues. So again, another example of alcohol and tobacco can be shoved into either the IRS or the Treasury or something else associated with taxation, because that's really what they're doing. The explosives, meaning the BATF-E, explosive part of the ATF, can be pushed into the FBI, because really all you're talking about is some expertise, which is legitimate expertise for law enforcement purposes about bombs and flames and explosions and all that kind of stuff. Very important to know. But again, they don't have to be in the ATF. They don't need their own agency. They can easily move those people and the knowledge, the equipment, the buildings, the rooms, the structures that they use for training, this kind of stuff. You could easily move that to the FBI or some other part of federal law enforcement without breaking a sweat, which gives rise to what? The only thing left we haven't talked about, which we're now going to do so, is the firearms. We've talked about the BA, the BT, and the BE, but what about the BATF? What about the F, or the firearms part of BATF? Now, this is where that is getting extremely interesting and good news for the Second Amendment. You got to look at this carefully, how this is breaking down, what is going on here. Now, several weeks ago, I did a video that said that the ATF, by taking their law enforcement agents and moving them to immigration enforcement, is a sign that something is afoot. And what do I mean by that? Again, if you look just at the firearm component of BATF, it breaks into two parts, okay? It breaks into law enforcement and it breaks into the regulatory side, right? The BATF, as applied to firearms, breaks into law enforcement, criminal injustice, criminal indictments, arrest, carrying guns, function as a police officer, function as the FBI, if you will. That is what the law enforcement agents do at the ATF. But the second part of the ATF is the regulatory part. This deals with the National Firearms Act. This deals with the technology people as to whether or not something's a short barrel rifle or a short barrel shotgun. Is it a bump stock? Is it a machine gun? Is it a silencer? All these kind of technical things that you have to deal with when people say, well, I got a new gun, what do you think? And you got to send it to ATF or whatever it is. You want to get classification letters. I won't bore you with the details. The bottom line is it's really a civil regulatory function, more like an FDA, more like an EPA, more like the Department of Education. None of those things I just described, the FDA, the EPA, or the Department of Education, for example, they, as a general matter, don't go out and arrest people. They don't have law enforcement capabilities or anything like that. If they uncover a crime, they pick up the phone, they call up the FBI and say, we think there's a crime, come check it out. Or maybe they call up the U.S. Marshal Service, maybe the Secret Service, and say, check it out. But the point is they don't really do law enforcement in the same way. So again, when you look at the firearms component of the BATF, it has the law enforcement system. Now here is the thing. The law enforcement agent part of the firearms of the ATF has now been reassigned for all intents and purposes to immigration enforcement. This is one of the first things President Trump did, is he said that all those law enforcement agents with the legal authority to arrest you, to carry guns, to carry a badge, to do all that like cops and robbers stuff, all those folks are basically being reallocated to either cartel work, immigration work, gang work, but they're being moved in to a function that is very similar to what? It's very similar to the work performed by the FBI. See where this is going, folks? See where this is going? Kash Patel, director of the FBI. Dan Bongino, deputy director of the FBI. Law enforcement agents working for the BATF and the firearms division being moved to do work that is traditionally done by the FBI. See what's going on here? Those ATF agents are basically being reassigned from the ATF to work with the FBI on those non-firearm issues. And that's the key, non-firearm issues. And by non-firearm issues, I'm not talking about gangs that use guns to commit murders. I'm not talking about, anything like that. I'm talking about the classic malum prohibitum, victimless gun control laws we see in the Gun Control Act and the NFA, these other items where, again, you can go to prison for years because of some nonsensical object you have in the back of your closet that never heard a flea. And that is what almost all federal gun control law is. And I keep hammering this point home. I've done this in many contexts, many venues, not just on this channel. A lot of people have heard this message, and I think it's getting through, which is federal gun control laws are malum prohibitum, victimless crimes. There are no victims. There's no evilness to it. There's no immorality to it. These are arbitrary lines drawn by legislators. And of course, you should follow the law. I'm not saying you shouldn't follow the law. But the reality is, if you're going to deploy billions of dollars in law enforcement assets to try to crack down on criminals for the good of society, you should be focusing on the violent thugs, which is exactly what Pam Bondi and Donald Trump have announced, that moving forward, they're going to laser focus on dangerous, violent thugs in this country, the cartels, the gangs, and the like, the fentanyl traffickers and the like, and they're not going to be harassing people like Eric Adams, the mayor of New York City, who maybe he did something wrong, maybe he didn't, I have no idea, and I don't care. The point is, he is not a violent thug. When we walk the streets at 3 in the morning, you go into a garage at 3 in the morning to go to your car, whatever it is, you're not worried about Eric Adams. It's the violent predators on our street that the FBI under Pam Bondi, Kash Patel, and Donald Trump are going to laser focus on. They made that announcement, and that means by extension, they're going to stop harassing gun owners who have done nothing wrong in any respect, and maybe they crossed over some ridiculous artificial line arbitrarily drawn by a legislature, but they are not doing anything that causes victims or injury or harm or death or anything of the like. And again, this is a very big deal, because by taking the law enforcement part of ATF and send it into other venues, send it into down other missions, it means you're not going to be harassing gun owners for those malum prohibitum crimes. Again, malum prohibitum just means it's a crime that has been enacted by the legislature with no moral component. That's in contradistinction from malum in se crimes, which is the Latin word for basically evil in itself, such as murder, rape, robbery, hitting somebody in the head with a baseball bat, things that you just know are inherently wrong as part of being human. I would say there's nothing evil about having the wrong size barrel, and no one would think that's the case. So malum prohibitum crimes are what all federal gun control laws are, and malum in se crimes is what we think about as real crimes: murder, rape, robbery, and so on. And it's good that this president and this administration are laser focused on those that have engaged in malum in se crimes and not malum prohibitum crimes. That alone is extremely good news for the Second Amendment and, of course, our right to keep and bear arms. Now, what does all of this mean? What this all means, as I see it, is the only thing remaining, listen carefully, the only thing remaining that has not been reassigned or is still within the ATF, and the ATF is still doing, is purely civil regulatory work. This is complying with the NFA. This is handling application for people that want to get a federal firearms license. This is handling application for people that want to add another classification to their FFL. This is dealing with licensing. This is dealing with these sorts of things that are really purely regulatory in nature. They're not law enforcement, and that's very good, because the reason why the ATF has historically screwed things up, like Waco, like Ruby Ridge, like the Fast and Furious nonsense, and I don't know what happened down there in Arkansas, but it doesn't look very good from my perspective what the ATF is doing. But the reason why, in my opinion, that the ATF keeps getting into this hot water with these ridiculous, stupid controversies, some of which have tragic consequences, is because these ATF law enforcement agents are trying to one-up or demonstrate to their FBI big brothers that they're just as good at law enforcement as the FBI. They're just as smart as the FBI. They're just as prestigious as the FBI. They're just as cool as the FBI. So they, as a consequence, they go out and they basically try to sort of do more than they're capable of doing, and that's when they get into these big kerfluffles. Waco, Ruby Ridge, Arkansas, Fast and Furious, and so on, because they get out over their skis and go beyond their capabilities, and bad things happen. But the only reason why they're making these sort of dumb decisions and exercising poor judgment is they're trying to one up, or at least demonstrate they're on par with their fellow federal law enforcement agents like the FBI. But if you take those ATF law enforcement agents and you basically shift them over effectively to the FBI, there's nothing left at ATF except that regulatory component. And the reality is this: that regulatory component could be easily moved to where? It could be easily moved to the Department of Commerce. Now, we could talk about the Department of Commerce and some of their import-export games that they played under Joe Biden that's kind of carried over a little bit. I don't think we have to worry too much about that. I think that issue will get cleaned up in due course. But the bottom line is there is no reason why you need the ATF anymore. And I think the fact that you've got Kash Patel, Pam Bondi, Donald Trump, and Dan Bongino, all of whom are familiar with these issues that I've just described, talking about this, I think there's a very good chance that A and T of ATF will be moving into some sort of tax-related department away from the ATF. The explosion people, the fire people, the arson people at the ATFE will likely begin shifted over to the FBI because they have specialized expertise. They're really compartmentalized. And the firearms part of the BATFE, that's already getting whacked up in half. All those law enforcement agents with arrest powers have been moved from the ATF in effect. De facto, they may still get checks from the ATF, if you will, but they've been moved effectively into immigration enforcement and other classic non-ATF related work. And that just leaves the little sliver there of regulatory stuff that you could easily move to the Department of Commerce, which I think historically is viewed as a place that's favorable to commerce. It's got to get fixed. There's a lot of problems all across the government, but the Department of Commerce has historically been more favorable to engaging in commerce, which is why I think the gun industry wanted to move the firearms licenses for import-export rules and things like that, especially the export business, away from the Department of State to the Department of Commerce. That occurred under the first Trump administration. Historically, the Department of State, for example, was responsible giving out licenses to FFLs that wanted to export firearms and weaponry overseas. The Department of State had to vet those, and that was a pain in the butt because the Department of State, as a general matter, we all agree, does not like America. They don't like American businesses. They don't like American guns and so on. They're really anti-American types. The Department of State has been known to be that for many, many decades. With that said, all that got moved to the Department of Commerce, where the Census Bureau is, and commerce is presumably about encouraging American commerce. And that would be a logical place, not just to move the firearms licenses for exports, which is already in the Department of Commerce. That would also be a logical place to move the regulatory effort of making sure the FFL's bound books are correct, the licensing is correct, the background checks using artificial intelligence for people that apply for NFA tax stamps, all that kind of stuff. Can be, and I think ultimately may very well be, moved to the Department of Commerce away from the ATF. So as you can see, breaking down what's going on with the ATF in sort of constituent parts you got to do it very specifically and look at what's left. You'll see that there's not a lot left of the ATF in terms of the trend. So the question is, will the Congress and others go along with these kinds of things that I'm discussing? But I can assure you that that team of Donald Trump, Pam Bondi as Attorney General, Kash Patel as the director of the ATF, a director of the FBI and acting director of the ATF, along with Dan Bongino, who's going to be the deputy director of the FBI, and I would guess kind of the indirect acting deputy director of ATF in effect. I'm just guessing that's how that's going to play out. This is all very good news because you have a very strong Second Amendment group of people there. Kash Patel is clearly on the record, good on guns. Dan Bongino, the same. So I'm very optimistic we're going to be moving in a good direction. But again, one thing we will have to talk about down the road is whether or not the Republican-controlled Congress can get their act together, or are they going to mess up all this good work that Donald Trump and the executive branch is doing by not making any of these cuts or any of these changes permanent? That I cannot predict, but obviously we're going to have to talk about the Republicans in the House and the Senate down the road. But in the meantime, I think that everything I've just described is setting the groundwork for what could very well be the permanent demise of the BATFE. I think that is something that is now potentially within our sights, in a way that in the past it was really just a pipe dream. It may no longer be a total pipe dream, folks. It may be something that can come to fruition and become reality. And I certainly hope that's where we get, but we have a lot more work to do because, as you know, freedom is not free, and a lot of people want you disarmed and to be turned into a serf and not a citizen. But that's not how we view things here at the 4 Boxes Diner. So there you have it, folks. Hope you learned something here today. Make sure you follow me on X at 4 Boxes Diner, and make sure you subscribe. We're trying to get to 200,000 subscribers on YouTube. Don't forget to also follow me on Rumble. We're trying to build that up a little bit as well. And I look forward to talking to all of you very, very soon here at the 4 Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.